Hey everyone, I'm Norn Queen Alexis, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to this series where we are going over all the war gear, equipment, and vehicles of the Astra Militarum. Today we are going over the medium tanks. Now, I know a lot of you are going to be like, Alexis, the Leman Russ is a heavy tank. In normal circumstances and actual military doctrine, by today's standards, the Leman Russ would be considered a very heavy tank. But in Warhammer, scale is very silly. The Leman Russ is the mainline battle tank the of the Astra Militarum, but as a classification, it is technically a medium tank for them because they have heavy tanks and then they have super heavy tanks. So there's three light tanks that I'm just lumping into this and just calling it the medium tanks. And yeah, there's a lot to dive into. Mostly the Leman Russ, which I'm going to mention, I think 14 different times because they keep changing the turret and calling it a different tank. But the different turrets make it do different battlefield roles, so they are technically different tanks, but it's the same tank, but for different aspects of the war itself. So, we're going to be jumping right into this, but first we have to define what a tank is. So, what is a tank? A lot of people tend to get this wrong, and I had a few people disagree with me that the armored personnel carriers can't be classed as tanks because they're not a tank, but they can be. A tank is just a designation for an armored fighting vehicle intended as a primary offensive weapon in frontline ground combat. Thank you, Wikipedia. So a tank is anything that drives to the front or is the main punch of the army itself that is also armored. Typically, they are tracked vehicles, and I say typically 9,000% of the time they are tracked vehicles, but there are some wheeled tanks that have existed in warfare. There are also hover tanks, so I need to designate it. There's a Kovu right there, and yeah, so that's what a tank is. So let's dive right into this. So let's go ahead and start things off with the three light tanks. Those three tanks being the Hellhound, the Devil Dog, and the Bane Wolf. These three are based off of the Chimera chassis, so grab your las guns, it's time for lore. Starting us off, we have the Hellhound, the most feared of the three tanks coming up, and currently the most common build for this variant of the vehicle itself. It is based off of the Chimera chassis, which, if you didn't see the last part, the Chimera is probably one of the best vehicles in all of Warhammer 40k. It is fast, it is reliable, it can do 55 kilometers an hour off-road, which is insane. I think it's 70 kilometers on-road. Yeah, 70 kilometers on-road, which makes the tank extremely quick for as big as it is. Though this tank does swap out its troop transport and all of its comms equipment, its command comms equipment, for a gigantic tank filled with holy promethium and varying other substances that would be used, promethium being the most common, and promethium can melt steel beams, so let's just be real about this. Not Devil Dog, I'm just going to fuse all of the names right now. The Hellhound, also nicknamed the Dragon, is a anti-infantry tank. This tank is designed to go through cities, go through trenchways, and just burn and kill everything in its path. It will light buildings ablaze. It will spit out flames all around it, and then bulldoze through cities, just burning any heretics that it sees. Though it does have one big, gigantic, massive, important weakness, that being the tank on the back, which you can then just shoot with a gun and cause enough of a spark to blow up the entire tank. The crew of it is often more concerned with shock and awe and fear tactics, that most people want to hunker down or run from this thing instead of trying to coordinate firing at it. This tank is extremely fast, as I stated, so its main goal is to go through a city as quickly as it can, burning everything in its path where enemies might be located. So very important to this vehicle itself is the cooperation of scout vehicles, such as the Sentinels or Rough Riders, to pinpoint locations that they need to go in and take out, or to coordinate artillery barrages. But if the strategic value is deemed too high, they will simply go in with this unit and they will drive in as quickly as possible, burn the target without causing too much damage to the overall structure of it. And while, yes, prolonged promethium will eventually melt ceramite and will melt adamantium, it does tend to take a very long time, and typically they can control the flames if the battle is winding down. How they do that, I have no idea. But this tank is mostly used as a shock and awe fear tactic style tank, and with its massive weakness, it is overall still a very cool tank. This tank can be equipped with various pieces of war gear, so not only does it have its massive Inferno cannon on the top of it, which I believe it is just called an Inferno cannon. Yes, it is. When it comes to guard and vehicles nowadays, they all have like this name, so forgive me. This weapon, or the varying war gear that this thing can be equipped with, is cameline netting, a dozer blade, extra armor, hunter killer missile, pintle mounted heavy stubber or storm bolter, searchlights, or smoke launcher, and or a smoke launcher. Typically, this tank doesn't need, it'll use its smoke launchers to get as close to the enemy as possible, or it'll already have picked a location to start in by coordinating with the scouts. So it will pick a spot where it can hunker down, cover itself in a cameline net, and just sit there for a very long time until it's needed for that ambush, where it will then go in and burn an entire like supply line or burn an occupied building after they're setting up inside it. So you have your force move through and start garrisoning a couple of buildings, and as you're garrisoning them, this thing can just come rocketing towards you, burn your entire building, and trap you within it as you burn to death, while this tank just simply runs away, coordinating with the scouts to figure out how to best get out of the situation and then re-hide and do it all over again in hit and run tactics. But this tank can also just be a frontline tank. It's still a Chimera chassis. It is still heavily armored. Well, less heavily armored than the heavier tanks that are coming, the medium tanks. But this tank is designed for hit and run specialties. The Bane Wolf, Canada's favorite little war crime. The Bane Wolf is a weapon of war that is even more horrific in nature than the Hellhound. When burning an enemy alive isn't enough, this thing's brought out. This thing is a chemical weapon specialist that shoots out a horrific spew of chemicals and poisons that just absolutely annihilate enemies and make them melt. It turns you into that guy that got unfortunately melted by toxic waste in RoboCop. This thing is absolutely horrific. The liquids from this chem cannon, yes, it's called a chem cannon, not a cum cannon, but the chem cannon is so absolutely nasty that it will melt the skin off of your bones. It'll shoot so much like toxic waste at you that you will just melt. This is a weapon designed to destroy the enemy. Like, it is so brutally horrific that it embodies the Imperium perfectly. And the weapon is so damn inefficient that while these things are operating in field, there is a very good chance that if battlefield conditions change, if weather changes, and suddenly the wind is going towards you, that you are going to die because this tank fired downfield. So this thing could have fired at an enemy 9 miles away from you, and you would be like, oh, right, we got the chimeras going into battle, awesome. And then all of a sudden you see this toxic cloud coming towards you, and you melt. And then the commissariat is just like, oh, don't run away. Nope, 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 no, 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 bang. If you run, go towards it. Go run towards the enemy. And before you melt, kill the enemy. This tank is absolutely monstrous and is something that I believe to be, this is theory territory, I believe to be something left over from the Horus Heresy. This is a weapon that would be specially used by destroyer squads to either irradiate or annihilate a planet. These are weapons that are so horrifically dangerous that they are going to augment the entire planet's structure afterwards. So you're going to have radioactive or chemical clouds for the next 100 years thanks to this tank. It is I don't I don't know how to describe how terrifying this tank is. Though I do believe it's not as efficient as the Hellhound because the Hellhound has Promethium. Promethium is way easier to make, and the vehicle is still on the chassis of the Chimera, which means again it's moving at 55 kilometers per hour. Off road, on road, it's moving at 70 kilometers an hour. It has all the standard war gear that all of them have. So it has Cameline netting, it has dozer blades, smoke launchers. It can have a hunter killer missile. It can have oh my god, a storm bolter if it needs to. But it is going to have its front mounted chem cannon and then a heavy flamethrower typically. That's the same with the Hellhound. The Hellhound can swap out its heavy bolter for a heavy flamethrower. It also states that it could swap it out for a multi-melta, but I've never seen that actually done in the lore. It's always just a flamethrower. So that's where I believe this tank is going to, be most efficient, is short-range weapons that on a fast-moving vehicle so that it can run up to the front lines, melt everything, and leave. Absolutely love this little war crime. It is absolutely horrific to run into. Next up, we have the Devil Dog. I almost said Hellhound again, which is a variant of the Hellhound that uses a Melta cannon. So you might be asking yourself, Alexis, what the hell is Melta? That is a very, very good question, and the lore on it changes quite a bit. Needless to say, it is an anti-tank fusion weapon, I believe, because it vaporizes air molecules. It's two chemicals that come together and blast out of it and is so hot that it can vaporize air. How they contain this and how they weaponize this, I have no idea. It's sci-fi magic that makes this thing work. Regardless to say, it fires similarly to either a beam or a shotgun blast is how we're most used to seeing it. So it's either a cone that immediately comes out of it, or it's a beam that goes forward towards the enemy. But it is a rather slow moving shot versus the less concentrated cone that comes out of most Melta guns. And I will go into Melta in more detail once we cover what Melta, Plasma, and Las weapons are, and bolt weapons are in the future. Needless to say, this is an anti-tank weapon. It is a short-range anti-tank weapon that is mounted on the turret of this thing. Again, this is the fastest moving vehicle that the Guard have access to for a tracked vehicle, moving again at 55 kilometers an hour. I need to preference this as to how fast this vehicle actually is. And this vehicle is designed to engage light tanks to medium tanks to structures. So it is going to use its speed, again, coordinating with scout companies and coordinating with artillery companies so that it can get all the information that it needs, communicating with chimeras to get all the information on where certain key locations are, key units are, or where supply lines are being run or tanks are being driven so that they can do a flanking maneuver, hit those tanks and run. Again, because this tank is more lightly armored than the heavier tanks that we're going to be talking about in just a moment, this tank specializes in hit and run tactics. Again, utilizing that speed to run in, neutralize a tank by either shooting it in the tracks or the back into the engine, either destroying the tank or immobilizing it momentarily. And when a weapon such as the Melta gun actually hits a vehicle, it isn't going to break apart the tracks like an autocannon would, where it hits, explodes, and the pieces are still there. This thing is going to fuse the tracks together and make the tank unable to move and melt a good chunk of it. So, like, if it hit in the front here, it would melt all of this, which would then cook the crew inside because of the sheer heat of it. So even if this thing gets a glancing hit on a tank, chances are, if it's close enough to the enemy tank, it's cooking the crew inside, which is exactly what this thing is designed to do. It is designed to damage, immobilize, and kill tanks. So, hit and run tactics, coordination, and the most effective use of this vehicle is to just hit, get out, and keep alive as long as possible. This tank can also be equipped with several other pieces of war gear, again, like a thing to protect its tracks, which it kind of needs, to be honest, because this thing is a light tank. A autocannon could spin around, or a heavy bolter could spin around, shoot this thing's tracks out, and then it's immobilized, and then it's dead, because they can stay out of its effective range of its inferno cannon and pepper this thing until it dies. It's equipped with a secondary weapon system, usually a heavy flamethrower or heavy bolter, though it can be equipped with a multi-melta, which is another melta type weapon, though that will be taking a lot of power from the vehicle itself. The vehicle itself has the chemicals that go into the melta weapon in the back, as well as an extended engine to maintain what it needs for the heat distribution of the vehicle itself, and an um, and a better engine. Well, how to put this? It has more power to power its weapons than typical hellhounds or the not the devil dog, the Bane Wolf, where the Bane Wolf and that rely on just having storage for the ammunition. This thing needs a more advanced system and more power to power its cannons. The cannon itself isn't useful after a few dozen shots and needs to be replaced often. So this thing doesn't can't really operate out in the field for very long. This is something you'll find with most melta weapons is after a few dozen shots, even though they have like heat protection, it still overrides the tank. It still overrides the machine itself, the operator, the weapon itself, and will still damage it over time. And after a bit, it will become too dangerous to use, and that weapon will have to be recalled and then refitted and re-outfitted back out to war. And there is a chance that as they keep trying to fix that piece of war gear, it will just keep failing quicker and quicker. So yeah, it's a bit scary shooting this thing, because there is a chance that if this thing's been repaired for the 10,000th time, that it might just fail on the first go and destroy its whole turret. Typically, that doesn't happen, and in most of the lore that I've seen, that has never happened. In fact, this thing is rarely mentioned in books. I think it's only mentioned in like one book. Let's see, outside of codexes, it is not mentioned in a single book, which is a shame because, like I said, this thing is a really, really, really good tank. It's incredibly easy to build, and if it's based on the Chimera chassis, that means the crew themselves know how to repair the vehicle. Granted, they'll never tell any of the tech priests or anything. They'll just be like, "Oh, we just prayed and it worked." They'll never tell them that they're operating on the vehicle itself to fix it, but it does have a good suspension. It does have good speed. It has decent ground clearance. This vehicle is extremely quick, and I think that this should see more battles, because this vehicle should be the thing that is following close to the scout companies, not as a scout tank itself, as a mainline tank, but it should be one that coordinates and destroys supply lines as quickly as possible to ensure that the Leman Russes can then run over the enemies, or just the sheer amount of guardsmen can just occupy the zone and deal with the threat that they're currently fighting. These vehicles are extremely fast and extremely good, and I have to emphasize that. And it should be used more. There should be an entire story based on this tank and this tank alone. But I digress, there isn't. So that is the 3 light tanks. Now we're going to start moving on to the heavier tanks, which is just code for we're talking about the Leman Russ next. So let's talk about some Leman Russes. So before we get into the next line of vehicles, which are all just Leman Russ with or Leman Russ without, we have to discuss what the hell the Leman Russ tank actually is. So the tank itself is just this part. We're not counting the turret in this case because the turret's going to just keep changing, but the weight of the turret is actually included, as well as most of the ammunition, I believe, which is a little bit weird for a tank to, weigh its ammunition before putting the weight of its actual tank prior, but we don't know if this is before or after armament. I'm I'm going to assume this is before armaments. So this is before the ammunition storage, which this tank would have a lot of ammunition in. Unfortunately, it would probably have a bit too much ammunition in, and that would actually be more detrimental to the tank itself because if a round penetrates, it could very easily hit the stored warheads inside it, or not warheads, tank shells inside it, causing a mass reaction to blow up the entire tank. I play War Thunder or World of Tanks. Yeah, one of those two. I play one of those two. I know how tanks work. I'm a professional. Now, I will state that I am not a historian or anything. There is a series on my channel called Everything Wrong with the Leman Russ, where I go into it with an actual military historian. And in that video, we actually talk about all of this tank's major flaws, and there is a ton. There are so many flaws with this tank. It's too big, it's too heavy, it's got the wrong equipment for its job, it weighs way too much. It is just a mess of a tank. Its shape is not efficient. It has too many flat edges. It doesn't have enough curves, so it can't bounce or ricochet anything. There is a direct open line to its engine that you can exploit straight from the back. The tracks are completely exposed sometimes, depending on war gear. And if you get near this tank, you could just throw a grenade on top of it and blow this tank up. It's a very poor designed tank. Granted, that also means that you need to approach it, so good luck. And it will have a cupulative mounted weapon, like a heavy stubber, to spin around it and fire if infantry starts getting close to the vehicle. But ambushes are very common in 40k since there's thousands of people. Oh, actually, it's more like millions of people fighting you. So again, it's good for the wars that it's in. If this thing was in the real world, it would be absolute garbage. But in the wars that it's in, this tank is good. Oh, also, the tank is too wide, it's too tall. I already said all that. The tank has many, 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 many flaws. But for 40k, it's a good tank. It can be easily mass produced. It can be easily repaired on route to its target. It is extremely reliable, which makes this tank really, really good. It can burn most things as fuel. So even if you run completely out of fuel, there is a very good chance that you can just use crude oils to power this thing. Or you can just steal gas out of regular cars that are around you and pump them into this thing, like armored vehicles and standard issue vehicles of that particular war zone, and pump it into this thing, and it would still work. So it is a very good tank, and this tank is not based off of a tractor. It's similar to the one that's based off of the tractor, but the one that's based off of a tractor is a different vehicle. This one is based off of a primary fighting vehicle for 40k. I haven't found lore that directly stated that the Leman Russ is just an armored tractor, but it would make sense given its design, and the real world tank that inspired it was inspired by just tractors. So yeah, there's a lot of myths and stuff about it, but we can see some stats here about it. Sorry, I have this on both screens so that I can keep my script up and everything. This tank is a little bit slow, only moving at 25 kilometers an hour, and on road, no, that is on road. It can move 29 kilometers, so about 30 kilometers per hour, and off road, it's only about 20. So it doesn't lose too much going off road, which is pretty good, and it is powerful enough to push itself through mud and everything. So it is a powerful tank. We have to give it that. It is a bulldozer after all. This thing is going to make it through the terrain. It's just going to sink a lot and tear up everything in its path. But it is going to get through it. This tank typically has, I think, 4 crew members, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just make sure. We have, I believe it's a commander, a weapon, a driver, and something else. I believe it has 4. It probably says it right here, and I just can't find it right this second. But there's not too many crew inside this tank, which is good. Um, so that's a benefit. And the side mounted sponson weapons are decent for dealing with extra threats, but that also means there's more ammunition storage inside this thing, which is actually more detrimental to the tank itself. And those heavy bolters are not going to store enough ammunition to last an entire battle. I think each heavy bolter stores about 600 rounds, which sounds like a lot until you realize that this thing is pumping out as many shots as like a actually it's not that many. It is a lot of shots. It's going to eat through that ammunition in like 30 seconds. And it's just going to fire and then lose all of its ammunition, and the side sponsons are now just going to be more of a hindrance to its movement than they are going to be for its fighting capabilities. It's actually why the Solar Auxilia didn't actually use them too much. It was more efficient to just have another Leman Russ next to you than it was to have side sponsons on the vehicle itself. Also, the side sponsons are a new addition to the Leman Russ, which is kind of cool because the Leman Russ from 40K is the combination of the Caradon and the Leman Russ from the Horus Heresy, just slapped together, where the Caradon was lost. Rip the Caradon. It was a light tank that was a Leman Russ stand-in, but it was very quick. It was a very good tank. Once I get to Solar Auxilia tanks, which will be its own separate video because they have very different vehicles, but once I get onto them, I will talk more about a really, really, really fast Leman Russ that was very good. But it was lost since the Heresy, and what they did is they combined it into the current Leman Russ model. So I thought we should talk about this before we actually get into what the Leman Russ actually is. The first of the many Leman Russ variants that we are going to talk about is the Destroyer Tank Hunter. The Destroyer Tank Hunter is a complex vehicle and much harder for most Forge Worlds to design than typical Leman Russes, and fits the same battlefield role as the Vanquisher or the Annihilator, which are easier for Forge Worlds to produce. This weapon is very difficult to build for most Forge Worlds, and it's quickly becoming a relic on the battlefields themselves, where most guard companies are not fielding them, or the ones that are fielding are not being repaired as often because it takes a specialist Forge World to repair and build this tank. So it's quickly falling out of favor for the guard itself. But this is a typical tank hunting vehicle, so it will sit, wait, hold its line, and then draw bead, again, utilizing scouts and everything like that. They're super useful. This is why scout companies need to have their own entire lore and everything, and I want a whole book on logistics. I would love that. If Star Wars can do it, 40K can do it, but they would actually need to hire people that know warfare, and they don't hire those people, and that annoys me because I want actual logistics. I want a full logistical book for 40K that has no actual like talking about the battle itself, like, oh, this great enemy and the super space marine protagonist beats the evil villain of the day, and whoa, the Imperium is saved, but it's still on the brink of dying. I don't want any of that. What I want is a book that talks about just the logistics of Warhammer, like what the administratum goes through to field the war itself, then goes to the scout companies being organized and everything being organized, even including like the Forge World orders and everything. I would love that book. I would sit there and read that book cover to cover thousands of times because that's the kind of shit that I'm into. I love that kind of stuff. But that has nothing to do with this tank. So this tank is just a tank hunter. It only has one battlefield role, and it is pretty decent at it. It has a very, very efficient tank cannon that I believe doesn't have it doesn't have an actual name. It's just the tank hunting cannon, or it can have the laser destroyer. The laser destroyer is a weapon that has recently come back to 40K thanks to Gilliman and Belisarius Call, which you can now see on the Repulsor Executioners, and the Gladiator, I believe, has a laser destroyer. But it was way more common back in the Heresy. This tank was way more commonly used by the Solar Auxilia. Again, we'll get into them later. But as the Guard don't have access to such rare pieces of war gear, so this vehicle is slowly becoming more and more extinct on the battlefield and is being overshadowed by the Vanquisher, which is a much easier vehicle to make. Before we move on to the next vehicle, I do want to talk a little bit more about this tank. I did forget a few things. One, this tank doesn't have side sponsons. It barely has any top sponsons, and it doesn't have a heavy bolter to defend itself from the front. so it doesn't have anything that can actually stop enemy troops from running up on it. Granted, you can get a pencil mounted heavy stubber or storm bolter to put on it. You can do cameline netting on this thing. Again, all the traditional war gear for an Imperial vehicle can be attached to this thing. But overall, the tank itself only serves one purpose and has to rotate itself because it cannot move its cannon in any way. It is just a straight up centerline cannon. So if the enemy is a fast moving unit, it is going to catch this thing, where something like the Vanquisher can actually start turning its turret and rotate itself to keep up to something trying to flank it. So just a little tidbit more as we go into the next tank, which also has the exact same problems. This is the Thunderer. The Thunderer is a really cool Leman Russ variant that is being outshined by the Demolisher. And again, it's another vehicle that can mount the laser destroyer or it can mount the Demolisher cannon, but it is centerline. Now, I have some theories about why centerline might be a little bit better than turret mounted, and that is for ease of loading shells and having auto loaders inside it to load this weapon and maybe have more storage in the back of it because they don't have to have the turret on top, the commandery spot, and the inside of the tank might be a little bit more open. But that is a theory, and I'm pretty sure I'm wrong about that. And if you are a history buff that knows tanks, please tell me. I'm not going to insult you. I want to know more. I would like to know more. But the Thunderer, again, suffers the same exact problems as the Destroyer Tank Hunter, which is a centerline gun that can't rotate quickly in an ever-moving battlefield. Now, granted, this tank would be really good, but there is a light self-propelled artillery tank vehicle that is way better than this thing, which is the Medusa. Or if you want a Demolisher mounted on a Leman Russ chassis, you go with the Leman Russ Demolisher, and then you get the actual full rotation of its turret, which is just much better, though it makes it taller. I don't see the height of the vehicles really factoring in too much in Warhammer, which is a shame because it definitely would. They would want lower profile vehicles to make use of cover and everything, but 40K doesn't care about actual real world physics and things like that. So the tanks being 12 foot tall is just silly and dumb. Like, you can see a 6 foot tall. I'm assuming this guardsman is a Chad and is 6 foot tall because all guardsmen are Chads. And this tank is twice his height. So I'm assuming that this tank is at least the same size as most Leman Russes, where it's gigantic. It is the Hunter Tank Destroyer is a bit faster than the Thunderer. The Thunderer is much slower. It probably carries a bigger load inside it, a Teehee, and overall it is just another tank that's slowly being replaced. The Thunderer is also just a replacement step for the Destroyer Tank Hunter, or I just mixed those up. Did I just mix? No. The Thunderer is just the Destroyer Tank Hunter with a different gun in it, because as the laser destroyer gets damaged and destroyed or needs to be refit or is difficult to repair, the Adeptus Mechanicus will simply slap the Demolisher cannon inside it. But apparently, this causes them so much stress that they hate doing it, and it might actually be something that is against the STC for this vehicle. So it is something that the AdMech reluctantly do. So that's why this tank is disappearing more and more, because they are just not doing it. There are better tanks, and this tank fills the same role as the Demolisher, where it's a close range support tank that is capable of absolutely annihilating buildings, which is really good. But having a turret that can spin, way better than a turret that is centerline for 40k strictly. Centerline weapons have seen success in battlefields all across the modern world, and well, not modern world. I think in World War II we stopped using. I don't know enough about real world tanks to actually state that as a fact, so my apologies. I am mistaken about real world tanks. I know about fictional tanks like this one, where this is slowly being obsolete compared to the easier to produce Leman Russes. Yeah. I know about fictional tanks, not real things that would be useful. All right, let's get to the most famous tank in all of Warhammer 40k, the Leman Russ, named after the Primarch himself, which the Space Wolves discovered the STC for on a I forgot the name of the world already, so my bad. They discovered it during the Great Crusade and named it after the Primarch, and this tank became the main battle tank of the Sola Auxilia at the time, and then was made in the millions during the Heresy itself, where it became used by the Imperial military and planetary defense forces. The Leman Russ is the easiest to build, well, not the easiest to build, one of the easier tanks to build for the Imperium. It does lack some advanced technology, so it doesn't have like good aspect scans, great communication equipment, but that's all fine because the tank is extremely reliable. And while it changed a little bit over the years from the Heresy till now, that's 10,000 years of service. And a Forge World can produce 10 million of these a year. Or, sorry, 10,000 of these a year. That's way different numbers. My apologies. 10,000 of these things a year, which is crazy numbers of these things hitting the actual battlefield itself. The main cannon is a 120 millimeters smoothbore cannon, smoothbore gun, and it has its problems with its elevation. You know, can't lower its fire. So if something is really close range, it has trouble shooting it. But that's why it has the massive las cannon on the front of it. The Leman Russ is the mainstay battle tank of the Imperial Guard forces. It is extremely rare for Imperial Guard to engage without one of these things, but they are incredibly slow. But they make up for that by being an armored up, heavily armored vehicle. In fact, it's one of the most heavily armored vehicles in all of Warhammer. It is on par in armor to the Land Raider of the Space Marines, which is crazy to think about because the Space Marines are the Space Marines. They're supposed to be the pinnacle of the 40k setting. They're actually not, but you know, they pretend to be. Well, they're told by their dad that they are. So, you know, they get the good boy star. But we all know the real heroes of the Imperium are the Imperial Guard. In fact, the real hero of the Imperium is Caiaphas Cain. But I wanted to talk about the Leman Russ especially. That's actually why I started this series, is because of the Leman Russ tank. I absolutely love this tank. It is hilariously, again, way too big, way too heavy, way too wide, way too... It has all the real world problems that you could imagine tenfold, okay? It has its massive weaknesses. But the Leman Russ is an anti-tank tank, but it doesn't... How to put this? Its tank cannon is as good against infantry as it is against tanks. It is an all-around unit, and it has side sponsons that can vary between multi-meltas, plasma cannons, heavy bolters, sometimes las cannons, rarely. I think I said las cannons. Hang on, let me go through the list again. It's heavy bolters, heavy flamers, multi-meltas, plasma cannons, sometimes, extremely rarely, las cannons. In the Heresy, it could be armed with Volkite weapons as well, and flamethrowers, bigger flamethrowers. But we're not talking about Sola Auxilia. We're talking about 10,000 years later. We're talking about the Leman Russ. Now, you can point out all of the wrong things about this tank, and yes, you can. But this tank is the Imperial Guard made manifest. And there was no better picture that I could find than this goddamn meme. Drive me closer, I want to hit them with my sword. The Leman Russ tank commander, in this case a Commissar tank commander, is just... he wants to be in that front line. He wants to push. And an aggressive push of Leman Russes is usually enough to overwhelm most opponents. There is not a lot that opponents can do against the sheer amount of Leman Russes, the sheer armor facing of the Leman Russes. But the Leman Russes are often supported by artillery and the scout regiments. So they have, like, once they start pushing into the battle itself, you are already flanked. Your backfield is already being sabotaged. Kasrkins are dropping in on you at the same time, and the Leman Russes are now pushing against you. It is very hard to target priority the Leman Russes, because once you do that, the Valkyries overhead are just going to drop troops upon you. armored vehicles are going to just come swooping around and killing key units that you have, or disabling your own tanks. So if you take your eyes off of the overwhelming amount of infantry and overwhelming amount of fast moving scout like vehicles that are dropping in on your location, the Leman Russes get to push up. But if you let those Leman Russes push up, they're going to overwhelm you and destroy you. And that tank is going to be so reliable that if it's damaged, the crew can get out of it, repair it, while other Leman Russes in that formation close around it to protect it with their armor. These things operate in units. They don't operate in like singletons. They can, but their preferred battlefield style is having 3 to 5 Leman Russes with an overall tank commander, and then each tank commander under them listening to the leader tank commander. I don't. They're all called tank commanders, but there's one that's super in charge. Um, the Leman Russ, while it does lack good communication equipment, good specs, it does rely heavily on its chimeras as support, as the chimeras are moving in with them to, be their eyes and ears to spot enemies for them, to tell them where to shoot. And even further out, they will be getting messages from the scouts telling them where they need to hit, where stuff is going, so that they can direct the slow moving Leman Russ to its target. So this thing is like crazy efficient on the battlefield. Granted, it does have its weak points. The rear armor of the Leman Russ, the under armor, is also fairly weak, but its front facing armor is 200 millimeters thick armor, which is crazy. This thing is super heavy and is often equipped with a dozer blade like it is here, which this tank will use in close combat. It will just crush people in its path because it's so heavy and so big and so powerful. Now, there are some downsides to the Leman Russ. It does have for the most part, a lower ammunition count for its main weapon. So it does rely heavily on a convoy constantly reloading its weaponry. And it is only going to have its side sponsons for so long in the battle before they become useless and are just there because they're out of ammunition or out of power. But that is not a problem for the Leman Russ. Because of its slow movement, it's usually supplied by a Chimera running equipment with a couple of Sentinels with powerlifters to reload this thing as they are depleting on ammunition. So let's go ahead and talk about this main cannon just a little bit more because it's a little crazier than you might think. This cannon, once fired, can elevate the tank slightly. Its recoil is so powerful that it can lift the tank, which is just kind of silly in itself, but that's how strong the battle cannon is. And it is considered one of the weaker weapons that this thing is armed with. Now, just like modern day tanks, it can be equipped with different shells. So you can have heat rounds, you can have other shells like penetrator shell. I don't know real world tanks. I know that there's like 10 different shells and they all have different acronyms for them. Needless to say, they exist within 40k and this thing can shoot them. The Leman Russ standard battle tank is the most universally used tank for the Guard and has a plethora of different shells designed for different enemies. It even has like a toxin shell that it fires at Tyranids, which is really cool. It only works a few times, but while it works, it's really cool. So the front-mounted weapon is typically a las cannon or heavy bolter. It can also be a heavy flamethrower or multi-melta, though those two are extremely rare. The most common is the las cannon, which is pretty cool, an anti-tank weapon on top of an anti-tank weapon. The las cannon fires a beam of light at the speed of light, go figure, so it's very hard to dodge, and it superheats its target until the point of bursting it. We don't know exactly what a las cannon fires. It might be accelerated protons, it might be plasma, but it does fire quick enough and it's strong enough to vaporize. It vaporizes rock. So it is strong enough to vaporize a person that it hits and burst them into pieces because their body will instantaneously vaporize. So all of their blood will boil and steam instantly, which will pop them like a balloon, which is hilarious. I absolutely love that. I love how over the top this weapon is. And its main turret fires fast enough to lift the tank, fires with enough force to lift the tank up. and has an insane range. This tank has the range of artillery, which doesn't say much because World War I artillery is what the Guard are typically using. So it only has a range of about 9 miles. World War I, early World War II artillery, and its range is only about 9 miles. But for a tank to have an incredible range that matches that is a little bit absurd. Though this has never been a thing in the lore, it has been a thing on the tabletop game itself, where this tank has the same range as the Basilisk. But earlier editions of the Basilisk had infinite range, so take that with a grain of salt. Needless to say, the battle cannon is an extremely long range firing weapon. Again, in the lore, we don't really see this too much, but we know that it does it. The secondary weapon systems, which are the side mounted weapon systems, are heavy bolters, heavy flamethrowers, plasma cannons, multi meltas, or. Nope, that's pretty much it. It really depends on what this thing's most common enemy is. The most common equipment on the side sponson of the Leman Russ is the heavy bolter, as it is the standard. But if this thing is going up against armored companies, it might want the multi-meltas, so that will pull more power from the Leman Russ itself. That's not really too big of a problem. Again, this thing is moving very slowly, so it lumbering into battle, this thing is described as lumbering, is fine because it can be just repowered back up with its just using promethium to refuel its tanks and just keep going from there. This is also true with its plasma cannons. If there's a lot of heavy infantry or a lot of, like if they're fighting Chaos Space Marines, they might equip themselves with plasma cannons as they're way more efficient against Space Marines. Or if they're fighting against light tanks or orcs, they might equip themselves with either heavy bolters or plasma cannons to deal with the hordes themselves. Against Tyranids, they're going to want the heavy flamethrowers because Tyranids tend to come in really close really quickly, so they want to be able to burn them away. And against well, that's pretty much it. These are the standard 3 weapons that it can be equipped with. In the Heresy, it had other options like autocannons, Volkite weapons, and a different type of heavy flamethrower. That's not the case in 40k. We are sticking strictly to 40k. I can speak English as my first language. I'm good at this. So let's go ahead and move on to what I consider to be the best variant of the Leman Russ, and I have reason here. Laser beams shoot at speed of light and have really far range is good. That's pretty much it. This is the Leman Russ Annihilator, which the Annihilator replaces its turret mounted battle cannon with the twin-linked las cannon. Now, you might be asking yourself, Alexis, what the hell is a twin-linked las cannon? Well, it's a las cannon next to a las cannon, as it shows in the picture here. I know. Crazy, right? Now, what makes the las weapon so good for the Imperial Guard? I have a whole video about that, and it's the las weapon video, and I've also talked about the Space Marine tanks, where the twin-linked las cannon was one of the best weapons because GW doesn't know about depleting energy, so technically the las cannons firing next to each other can also power their fuel cells, which then means that they fire an infinite amount of energy. This is according to Games Workshop. They can fire an infinite amount of time, so the top turret of a Predator Annihilator actually has infinite ammunition. This thing does not, and I want to explain why. Because the Predator Annihilator for Space Marines has its fuel cells inside the turret itself, it can use the energy to fire more shots. Now, in real world, if we did have a laser weapon that could do this and could power itself through heat, it would dissipate as it goes into the next one, so you wouldn't have infinite ammunition, you just have a lot of ammunition. This thing trades off the ammunition of the Leman Russ, having its 40 to 60 shells inside it, which is ridiculous. It's way too many. With having more power cells, which are volatile as well. So it's still dangerous if this thing gets penned and, hits its power cells and it's blow up. But, it's not 40k without a little bit of explosions every now and then, and your tank just blowing to bits because somebody got lucky. But what the Annihilator does is it has its twin las cannon, and then inside it is fed the power cells to the turret. and it has a lot more room for its power cells because there's no room for the tank shells. So this thing has a lot of shots. Where the standard lasgun has 100 shots to one cell, and the guardsman carries 1,000 cells, it is likely that this thing has 1,000 shots minimum, which is way better than all other variants of the Leman Russ. And because the las cannon is easily replaced and refurbished and redecorated onto this vehicle, it is way better of a vehicle than the Vanquisher, which is typically considered its equivalent. The Vanquisher is just way more popular amongst the guard and is way more celebrated amongst the guard, as it has a high velocity cannon that is super good at killing tanks. This thing is also really good at killing tanks, and in my opinion, more reliable because it has more ammunition. But that's just me. And I don't write for Warhammer 40k, though I would write a logistics book for it, and I would be happy to do so. But this tank, again, made by the tens of thousands, is really easy to repair in the field, pretty slow, pretty heavily armored, and has fuel cells instead of shells, as I've stated before. Its secondary armament system is exactly the same. The thing that just makes these variants different is the turret. So everything that I said about the Leman Russ is true about this tank as well. The only difference is the top-mounted turret. So, in my opinion, this thing having the twin las cannon with minimum 1,000 rounds of firepower of an anti-tank weapon is insane. You can't dodge this weapon, so once it gets a beat on you, because the las cannon fires light, you cannot dodge it at all in any way, shape, or form. You can't even be like, oh, I can stop timer, man. Ooh. No, you are getting hit by this thing, and it's going to kill you. It's going to vaporize what fluids you have, or any trapped, or it's going to superheat any material that you are to the point of explosion. And you're just going to be no more. You are gone. Good day, sir. I love this vehicle. I think las weapons are what 40k should be using. Like, all Space Marines should be walking around with multi-lasers instead of their standard issue bolt gun, because it just makes more sense. They carry 1,000 rounds. They're quicker firing. They're safer to use in boarding actions. They're much better at killing infantry than the bolt gun. So it makes way more sense to use a multi-laser or a heavy multi-laser, or even las cannons for Space Marines to just walk around with. But I digress. Warhammer has its favored weapons, and logic and reason go out the window with 40k. So we can all, say that, oh, Space Marine is just better with a bolt gun, blah 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 blah. Didn't you see that animation where a bunch of cultists who didn't know how to use a Leman Russ died to Titus and a bunch of Blade Guard veterans? And I'd be like, yes, and that's pretty accurate. They would die. Like, a Leman Russ would die to 3 Blade Guard veterans and a lieutenant known as Titus. Like, that's pretty obvious. But what they wouldn't survive is the second and third Leman Russ, or all of the Leman Russes. And if they operated correctly instead of being like cultists and, whatever. Neither here nor there, we're talking about this. This tank is really cool, really long range, shorter range than the battle cannon somehow. I assume it's just heat dissipation. Dissipation? Is that the word? Dispersion. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, brain. Where it's just at a certain range, it's no longer as effective, and it will just, disappear or just not be as brutal as it is up close. Granted, it's still a long range tank, so that its effective range is insane. Just have to point that out. And now for a tank that I'm not too sure if it's good, or how to put this. I really like this tank, but I feel like they could have just overtuned the engine of the standard Leman Russ and would have had more effective tank. But the Leman Russ Conqueror. The Conqueror is a less common variant of the Leman Russ tank and has a much shorter barrel than the standard Leman Russ, but still delivers the same high velocity rounds, but at a shorter range. Now, it sacrifices some of that to lower its weight, so it's not as heavy as the standard Leman Russ. From what I can see, it's still 62 tons. Its lore still states that it's lighter. Okay, I'm just going to assume that that is a mistake and that this tank is just a lighter variant. Its other weight says it's 63 tons, which makes it heavier. Okay, I'm going to assume that that's an error and that GW didn't know the numbers at the time. But this is supposed to be a lighter variant of the Leman Russ that is armed with a shorter ranged cannon, can be mounted with side sponsons and everything, but this tank moves considerably faster, 9 whole kilometers faster off road and on road. So on road, it moves 34 kilometers an hour, and off road, it moves 24 kilometers an hour, which, if you remember, is pretty much the exact same speed as the max speed of a Leman Russ. The standard Leman Russ moving 35 kilometers off road and moving 21 kilometers off road. So its stats don't match what its lore states that it can do. And because I know GW doesn't actually know numbers too well, they are not military historians, they do not know how the classifications of tanks work, I'm going to assume that that is an error and that this tank is supposed to be faster than the standard Leman Russ, because that is what its lore says. Being a faster variant of the Leman Russ means that it is still outperformed by every other scout variant, but these might be one of the first in line Leman Russes to start hitting the battlefields. Being a slightly quicker variant of the Leman Russ means that it can get to key locations a bit quicker than the regular Leman Russ, so the enemy might misunderstand the situation and think that these are the only Leman Russes that they're going to be fighting, and thus engage them if they see low numbers of them, when in fact these Leman Russes are designed to be the first line of Leman Russes, where the other ones will then lumber to their positions and then take fire at the enemies shooting at the Leman Russ Conqueror. It is pretty much that's all it's really used for. It's armed exactly the same. It has the same equipment inside it, can be equipped with the same secondary equipment like smoke launchers, hunter killer missiles, improved comms, minesweepers, rough terrain modifications, track guards, camo netting. It could have a heavy stubber on top or storm bolter. For its side, can still have all of its standard weaponry. For its main turret, can still have a las cannon or can have a heavy bolter. It's a standard Leman Russ with a shorter barrel that's designed to flank enemy units. One other thing that I did want to mention about the Leman Russ Conqueror, unlike other Leman Russ variants, well, most other Leman Russ variants, this thing can actually fire while on the move and maintain its targeter. So maintain its target, which is super cool. Like, it's a tank that can move and shoot. We've never seen that in the history of forever. That has definitely never been a thing accomplished in any war in the history of forever. There's definitely not video of tanks jumping in the air and firing their turret. I just wanted to point it out. I love the fact that they point it out in the lore and they make it like this big deal that this tank can do this, and it it gives the same energy as my tank's not useless. It can do this, and it's like, yeah, so can almost any of the other vehicles because they're heavy enough to fire their turret. Maybe the mainline battle cannon can't fire and move because the tank could flip the tank, which is so bizarre. Like, why wouldn't you just take the las cannon variant, which doesn't have any recoil at all because it's shooting light? That tank can definitely move and shoot. The Vanquisher probably can't. It probably wants to get stabilized. That goes Kovu. But I guess the Demolisher also. So I guess that this and the Annihilator. So again, another point to the Annihilator being the best Leman Russ chassis there is. But another point to this tank. I will add that because, as I said, it does actually sound like something that it can do that's good. Although the light tanks like the Devil Dog and the Hellhound can also do this. Like, they can just drive around and shoot. And even some of the lighter vehicles that are not tanks, the light APCs can do this. So it's just kind of cool that a heavier tank can do this. And apparently it's faster. And I found its actual speed. It says that it does weigh 62 tons. And somehow that is lighter than the 62 tons of the Leman Russ. So I'm guessing one's using European measurements for tons and one's using the American, I guess. And this thing can go 30 kilometers per hour off-road. So that's pretty good. It's pretty good. Now we move on to the most useful of the Leman Russes, in terms of tabletop anyway. The Leman Russ Demolisher. The Leman Russ Demolisher is my favorite variant of the Leman Russ for tabletop games, where my favorite in the lore. God, no, I'm still. I really like the Vanquisher. I'm a sucker for a Vanquisher. But the Leman Russ Demolisher has a special place in my heart because this thing destroys everything. It is the most common variant of the Leman Russ battle tank. So, while the standard one is the Leman Russ battle tank, which has the battle cannon, this one is the most common of the variants, which is the Demolisher. It is mostly used for sieges and more heavily used in urban warfare than anything else. I believe it says it's used for sieges in urban and siege warfare, which whatever that means. So it's mostly used to destroy enemy bunkers, heavy vehicles, infrastructures, demolish any infantry that's in front of it, whether that be normal infantry, heavy infantry, or even super heavy infantry. This thing will kill. Space Marines have to duck when this thing fires. It is a very, very short ranged tank. It can only fire effectively at 1 kilometer. So it's not, it needs to lumber all the way to the battlefield. So these things are typically staged. These things are typically staged onto the battlefield itself or dropped in via Valkyrie drop by the Valkyrie Sky Talon to get to where they need to be. So they're not the main battle tank that you'll see going through, but they are the ones that are going to be coming behind the main rush of either Leman Russes or Conquerors, where this thing is going to then start moving forward and start destroying fortresses or being dropped in by Sky Talons to get to their location a bit faster. The weapon itself is massive. This thing is going to kill whatever it hits. It destroys entire buildings when it hits them. It is a crazy effective weapon, and this vehicle has often seen heavy use on tabletop. When I run my guard, I typically run 3 of these, and I also run a couple of Vanquishers because I really like the Vanquisher. It never hits, but I really like it. Its typical side armament is a heavy flamethrower, or if it comes from the Forge World Ryza, it has plasma cannons, but it can be outfitted with multi-meltas, heavy flamethrowers, and extremely rarely, las cannons. Its front armament is typically a heavy bolter, but can be replaced with heavy flamethrower or las cannon. Typically, it's not really going to use a las cannon because this vehicle wants to be able to clear out the infantry that are going to be trying to rush it to throw bombs on it, or try to throw mines underneath it, or try to run on top of it. So you'll typically see these things armed with a heavy bolter in the front and 2 heavy flamethrowers on the sides. This way, once they clear the building in front of it, or the structure in front of it, or the gate in front of it and drive through, they could just burn all the infantry that's around it, or trying to run and get to it. You will also see a top-mounted weapon typically on these, which has a heavy stubber or storm bolter. You'll see smoke launchers deployed on these things all the times, track guards on these things. You will rarely see cameline netting put on these things, but if it is set up to counter siege, then yeah, you will see that on it where they're hidden and they just want to barrage things as they come close. Well, really close in this case. But yeah, that's pretty much what this thing is used for. It's just an anti-siege tank, and it is really, really good at killing Tyranids. Extremely good at killing Tyranids. Though it does have a low amount of weaponry. That's one of its main problems, is it only has 25 rounds for its main cannon. Typically, they are armed with autoloaders to help the people inside load that weapon and discard the shells. But it will only carry 25 rounds. So this thing is heavily reliant on a supply line to keep it functioning. And with such a short range, it's not really too reliant on the scout companies. So you're not going to really have the Rough Riders like, oh, I destroyed it, now you guys can run in. The Rough Riders would have already been doing that, or they'd be running around trying to find openings in their flanks and everything. So it really depends what this thing is needed for, but typically it's going to be destroying enemy structures and vehicles. So have you ever thought about getting cooked alive inside your own tank from firing its own weapons? Well, then there's a tank for you, the Leman Russ Plasmacutioner, or Executioner, but its nickname is the Plasmacutioner. The Leman Russ Plasmacutioner is an extremely rare variant of the Leman Russ and was way more common back in the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. But after the Scouring, it kind of disappeared because there weren't too many Forge Worlds still making these things. So it did unfortunately disappear for the most part after that. Ryza is the only Forge World that actively still makes these things, and they don't make a lot of them. So when they see the battlefield, it is a surprise to the enemies because typically they don't even know these things are coming. The Plasmacutioner uses a weapon called the Plasma Destroyer, which is the weapon as seen on the top turret. This is a very, very dangerous plasma weapon and has a lot of safety features built in, but is still a plasma weapon, still prone to overheating and destroying the entire tank. So, in case you just roll a 1 when you're shooting with this tank and just deal a whole bunch of damage to yourself. But it is really funny that this tank can cook itself. Typically, its side sponsons are going to be more plasma cannons, as Ryza is the plasma Forge World. Like, that's the whole thing that they focus on. They really like Dark Angels, I guess. And it does have a las cannon for the front mounted weapon. That doesn't stop it from having different side mounted weapons, but it is rare to see this thing on the battlefield to begin with. So, seeing it with different weapons is also just as rare. So, it's typically armed with plasma cannons, and this thing has a ton of problems with it. The main weapon itself draws so much energy from this vehicle that it's not going to be firing too often. Its main shot can only fire 12 from its protonic fuel cells. God, that is a 40k name. So it's only firing 12 times before it has to cool down and then have something unload it and then reload in another cell to it so that it can fire 12 more times, which makes this tank one of the most inefficient of the Leman Russ variants, though it does fire a blast at the enemy that is incredibly strong and capable of eating through super heavy infantry and maybe even small monstrous creatures or heavy or medium tanks. This thing does struggle with heavy tanks as they can shrug off a lot of the plasma blast from it and get in close and destroy this vehicle. So this is one of the Leman Russes that I think will eventually in the lore just fade into legend and become more of a relic rather than a mainline tank. This tank does everything the Demolisher does, but the Demolisher is just better, in my opinion. Just putting it out there. I think the Demolisher is a wee bit better. But it does have its uses. They're not the 12 shots is what really kills this tank. It just does not have enough to maintain proper battlefield. It can't stay out in the battlefield for very long before it needs to come back to a place to be rearmed, re-equipped, and then maybe even have its entire weapon changed because it overheated and cooked its crew. So there was a good chance that the crew just dies and this tank is just sitting there. So yeah, that's the Plasmacutioner. Really good on tabletop, terrible in the lore. So. This is the Leman Russ that the Space Wolves use. This is the Leman Russ Exterminator. The Leman Russ Exterminator is a specialized Leman Russ for anti-infantry fighting. This thing is really good at fighting medium, heavy, and light infantry. Not too much super heavy infantry as they can shrug off the autocannon rounds, but heavy infantry like Space Marines die to this thing pretty quickly. If they're hit by it, we'll blow them to pieces. But super heavy infantry like Terminators or Custodes will just have the shell bounce off of them. It'll hurt them, but it'll bounce off of them. I know that's kind of crazy to think about, like, boom, and just a tank shooting an autocannon at something, and it's just like, ow. But an autocannon is only an AP1 weapon, so, it is what it is. So this is a common variant of the Leman Russ, and it is used by the Space Wolves as well as the Imperial Guard. Though it is rarely used by the Space Wolves, it does still show up from time to time. This was mostly back in 3rd edition when the game had the Leman Russ being used by the Space Wolves. It has never been really used since then for the Space Wolves, though it has been casually mentioned here and there in the lore, so I thought I would mention that the Space Wolves make use of this thing. It is a specialized anti-infantry hunting tank, so as such, its side sponsons, which this picture does not have, sorry, I wanted to try to get artwork that is actually canon, well, not canon, but artwork from the books themselves. And most of it is actually just from the Lexiconum, which I hate. But this is taken from the Imperial armor books, and I really like it. Um, but its common side sponsons are just heavy bolters or heavy flamethrowers, and its common primary or secondary, not the las cannon, but that weapon would be a heavy bolter, just so it can punish infantry as much as possible. Its main gun only has 360 rounds and it fires pretty quickly, so it will deplete its ammunition very quick, meaning that it does need to be resupplied rather quickly. But with this tank being as awkwardly fast on roads, 40 kilometers per hour on roads, that's pretty good. But with this vehicle being as lighter, wow, it's a light tank. Well, lighter tank. It's only 58 tons. So that makes this tank lighter than the regular standard Leman Russ. So I assume that that means it can move quicker, which we just saw that it could on roads. So this tank is really good at just rolling around, firing at heavy infantry or firing through infantry lines, blowing them apart or picking out key targets to destroy, and then getting back to its supply train to get its ammunition back, to get back into the fight, doing constant, like, not hit and run tactics, but prolonged combat, then coming back, rearming, and then staying out to do as much combat as possible, using its armored frame to make sure it's facing just infantry, so that way they can't really harm this tank. But the second an anti-tank weapon starts appearing, this tank is going to start relying more on other Leman Russ chassis to do most of the work at the anti-tank for the anti-tank portion of the war. God, my brain is just barely working today. But I really like this thing because it's a really good dedicated knob hunter or tyrannid hunter, which is where it excels. But it's pretty poor against like Chaos Space Marines or enemy forces that includes extremely heavy infantry. Like even when the Tau bring their battle suits, this thing is going to have a bit of trouble fighting them. But if they bring wave tactics, this thing is very good at it. So if it's fighting crew, it's going to be good at that. But if it's fighting battle suits, it's going to be bad at that. So it has its battlefield role. I just feel like the standard battle cannon would just do better because it's an all-around gun versus this thing being a dedicated anti-infantry killer. But it still has its role and it's still pretty quick, so it can get its armaments back real fast and get back into the fight really quickly. There is also the case that this thing might just be set up somewhere and supplies might be run back and forth to it. So it's really good for a defensive thing that's fighting against hordes. I like the Exterminator. I think it's a more realistic of the tanks itself, though it should only have the one cannon. It has two. It has an autoloader built into it. It has a rangefinder. It has a laser for helping it find targets. It could be equipped with all sorts of, the standard equipment that you can expect a Leman Russ to be armed with. And overall, it is an efficient vehicle. It's the third most common Leman Russ chassis, so it has its role, clearly. How do we take the Leman Russ Exterminator and make it worse? I got it. This. So, this is the Leman Russ Punisher, which uses the Punisher Gatling Cannon, which sounds really cool until you realize that a minigun is a terrible main battle weapon. The minigun itself that it is using, and I say minigun, it's the Punisher Gatling Cannon, so we'll refer to it as the Gatling Cannon. This thing's gonna eat through ammunition so quickly. Like, this is better as an emplaced weapon where they can keep the thousands upon thousands of rounds of ammunition for it than an actual Leman Russ that is driving around super slowly on the battlefield. This turret would be better on the Chimera chassis. Like if the Hellhound had this weapon, that would be really good. Or if a lighter vehicle had a weapon similar to this, like an Onslaught Gatling cannon, that would be really good. But as a main battle weapon on top of a Leman Russ, this is awful. So let's get into this thing. One, this thing has the same armaments in the same armor, the same war gear options as the standard Leman Russ. So the side-mounted weapons can be exchanged for plasma, melta, heavy bolter, heavy flamethrower. The front-mounted weapon can be a heavy flamethrower or heavy bolter. All of this requires room inside the tank. Now, it is stated that this thing does strip down the inside of the Leman Russ to make room for more Punisher Gatling cannon ammunition, which I assume is belt fed. So this thing has tons and tons of ammunition inside it, but then it also needs to have its sponson weapons have ammunition and its secondary weapon have ammunition, which means if this thing rocks 3 heavy bolters, it needs to store all of those bolt rounds as well as storing this weapon. The Punisher Gatling cannon would be so much better if it was a multi-laser type weapon instead of a bullet-based weapon. I don't know if a minigun shoots bullets. I assume it does, but I could be wrong. They might be called like something super special or something. Again, I'm not good with real world military. My apologies. But assuming that it's firing like a standard minigun, which the only reference image that I have in my head is Terminator 2, and because that movie is so good, I'm going to assume that everything in it is entirely accurate, and that's how I'm going to base my entire video about this minigun, which is not a minigun, it's a Gatling cannon. Because obviously the Terminator would never lie to me. Because there were only 2 Terminator movies. And that's it. There are no more. And if you think there are, you're just hallucinating. Those are not Terminator movies. They're bad. And thus gone. But anyway, that put aside, the Punisher Gatling Cannon's crew is known to keep firing. Like they are very trigger happy and keep the gun down and just keep firing, which means that they're running out of ammunition even faster than a standard the standard amount of firepower that the autocannons would be using from the Exterminator. So this thing needs a constant feed of ammunition. It is so inefficient, in my opinion, and there's barely any lore about it. In fact, I don't even think this thing is mentioned in a book at all. Like an actual book, not like a novel, not an. Yeah. I think it's mentioned only in the Guard Codex, Imperial Armor, and that is that it? That's it. Holy crap. And an article. That's it. That's all that we have for this tank. It is a cool design. I really like it. If this gun was more equivalent to, like, say, the A10 Warthog's gun, but that gun is gigantic. This gun is a bit smaller. Or if it had some armor penetration, or it was better at dealing with medium infantry, because this gun only takes on light infantry. But I could design a tank that's a little bit better than this. So what you would do is you would take 4 multi-lasers, put them next to each other, using the charge from them to reheat all of the other charges so that this thing would be firing a Gatling laser similar to that from Fallout. And it would just be rotating a Gatling laser and have all of that, the cells inside it, because the cells can contain more ammunition than an ammunition canister could. I think that they're called canisters when it's or the ammunition box. I guess it's a box where the belt is fed from. Yeah, I watched Terminator. But if this thing was a Gatling laser, it would be much more efficient because it would have thousands of rounds of ammunition, more than the thousands of rounds of ammunition that it has normally. So, there's. Yeah. And especially if this thing has energy cell, like, if the plasma cannons are equipped to this, like it is in the picture, then you need to have room for those cells. And then you have to have heavy flamethrower fuel inside it if we go by this picture specifically, which is not an ideal way of running this tank. You'd run it with heavy bolters. So I'm just going to assume that it's going to be armed with heavy bolters because it wants to be anti-infantry. Heavy bolters are actually more effective weapons than the gun on top. A quad heavy bolter on top would be a more efficient weapon than that gun. But this is what we got. It's a cool tank, but it is the most inefficient tank for the Leman Russ. It's cool, but garbage. It gets a 0 out of 10. I would never, if I was a tech priest and they were commissioning Leman Russes for me, I would mistakenly send them a Leman Russ over this thing. I'd be like, no, we're not doing that. No, you don't get that. This tank's bad. Oh, the big boy is finally here, the Vanquisher. The Leman Russ Vanquisher. The Leman Russ Vanquisher is a tank that is specially designed to kill enemy heavies, super heavies, structures, anything in its path at any range. More specifically, really, really, really long range. This thing outranges the Leman Russ, which the Leman Russ is already meeting the effective range of most artillery. This thing is going beyond that. It has a hypervelocity shell that it can fire to destroy enemy super heavies. This thing is so powerful that if it hits an enemy vehicle, that enemy vehicle and its crew are dead before they realize the shell has passed through their tank. It is so powerful. It is equipped with a lot of rangefinders and more advanced technology than the typical Leman Russ, so that it can get its targets correct and get its targets at super long range where it's most effective. It wants to hide in the back, sit under cameline cloaks or whatever it needs to, or in a fortified position, and pick out enemy super heavies and destroy them. It wants to hunt knights. It wants to hunt super heavy tanks. It wants to hunt heavy vehicles. It wants to punch through a battle wagon at 3 to 5 miles away and blow it to bits. This thing wants to take a shot and kill its target in one round. The tank itself only carries around 28 rounds, but because this tank is so often in the backfields, resupplying this tank actually is very easy and efficient. They could just run their crews right up to it, reload it right into the back, and just be like, you're good to go. Tap, tap, kill the enemies. Boom! And get rid of it. The cannon on this thing is way more powerful than the standard battle cannon, and it takes very select Forge Worlds to actually build a cannon that can hold up to the shells that are used in this cannon. There's also a specialized shells for this cannon that no other tank can use. That's how specialized this vehicle is. But aside from its hypersonic shell that is anti-tank, it also has a Beast Hunter shell. This shell shoots, and I quote, once I can quote it, the shell themselves contains a powerful biomutagenic acid designed to be devastating against all organic matter. So not only is this thing plowing through the Hierophant, it's killing the Hierophant next to it with just melting it. It is such a cool tank. I absolutely love this tank. It's so long range, and sometimes, not often though, it does come with a coaxial weapon. So it does use a secondary gun system to find what it needs for a range. So that'll either be a heavy stubber, a secondary autocannon, or a storm bolter to track range for this weapon itself using tracer rounds. And then this thing will fire at its target. You don't typically see these things with side-mounted weapons, though I assume the most common, because it doesn't say it in the lore at all, but I assume the most common would be like other long-range weapons. So this thing is typically and probably, yeah, don't say that. This thing is probably going to be armed with heavy bolters, as they have one of the longer ranges and doesn't take away from its ammunition storage. Though it can be armed with plasma cannons, which have about the same range, same effective range, and it probably has a las cannon at the front of it just to also track with its trackers and everything for an extremely long range shot. In the Heresy, these tanks were just armed with a Vanquisher battle cannon, an autocannon with tracer rounds, and a las cannon. It didn't have side sponsons. This kind of tank you probably didn't need the side sponsons for, because it's targeting enemies that are so far away that it's probably targeting things outside of its effective range. In the tabletop game, of course, you're equipping this thing with side-mounted weapons, probably the multi-melta, because it's just such an effective weapon. But this is hands down one of my favorite of the tanks. I think I have to say it is my favorite. I think my top 3 Leman Russes goes the Vanquisher is number 1. Number 2 would be the Demolisher, then the Annihilator, then the standard battle tank. What would number 5 be? Hmm. It would probably be the Soul Auxilia Inferno one, but that's a whole nother tank. We're not getting into that one because that's Soul Auxilia, not Astra Militarum. Now, there are some other tanks that are mentioned in the lore as little lore blurbs that don't have official artwork or models or miniatures or any way, any type of doodles by Doodlebob. I can't find anything for them. And that is the APDS 6A Defender, which sounds like an AdMech vehicle, and it probably is. It's a Chimera with a laser destroyer on it. Obviously, that thing has been replaced by the Chemdog or the Hellhound or the other variants of that particular Chimera. So the Devil Dog, that's the one it was replaced by. I doubt it's still canon. And then we have the Behemoth Primal, a legendary battle tank. Again, probably not canon, probably just something that's mentioned. And then we have the Curtis tank, which is just something that was in a White Dwarf. There's also something called the King Russ, which is a double extended Leman Russ, typically with a Vanquisher cannon on top of it, and it has 2 sets of tracks on both sides. There is a model for it, but no official model for it. There's like somebody built a model for it. I don't believe this is canon. It's just silly looking. It's just a fatter Leman Russ, and I think that's just kind of chill, but that's it. So that is all for the Leman Russes. Well, the medium tanks of Warhammer 40k. Next, the next episode will focus on the heavier variant tanks, which will include things like the Malkador and the Macarius and, well, the Rogel Dorn, because that's in there. So if you guys want to see that, please tell me in the comments down below which Leman Russ variant is your favorite, or did you like the Chimera variants of the battle tanks? Personally, I think the Devil Dog, I went full New Yorker on that. God, somebody's going to quote that. But I think the Devil Dog is one of the most underutilized tanks that exist in 40k. It's a highly effective, very fast vehicle, and it's not seen anywhere. I think it's very underplayed. I really like it for lore purposes. I think it's great for like a frontline tank that's gonna rocket in really quickly. Not a scout vehicle, but like when you're trying to build your front line, like when you're trying to get your Leman Russes up to that line, you would want a bunch of these things to just take up that front and just rocket towards the enemy to distract them while you get your heavier tanks, well, your medium tanks, and then your heavy tanks into position to destroy your enemy. So yeah, tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. As always, I'm Northern Queen Alexis. I love you guys. Bye.